I want to thank the Montana Committee and the University of Montana, others who are involved in this program, for asking me to appear here, and especially Margaret, who is an old and dearly beloved friend. I put my watch up here. I like to do that. It's reassuring to people who don't know me. I know that some of you have other things to do. I put it up here because there's a calendar on it. So if maybe Sunday morning you need to go home, slip quietly out. I was asked a couple years ago to read from Circling Back, a book I wrote a while back. I think because there was some material in there about Lewis and Clark and about the mountain men. But as the program developed over the last couple of years, it seemed clear that we needed to hear some other voices as well. And so my plan has changed over time. I do want to read from some of those early voices and some that come a little later, from a series of documents that are related to the discovery. But I'm sort of going to ignore Lewis and Clark. You'll hear plenty about them from all the others on the program. You already know plenty about them yourselves. I doubt that I have anything new or different or important to say about them. Instead, I'm sort of pursuing an idea here. I'm not really sure even what that idea is, but as one reads disparate documents of all kinds, they take on the character of a mosaic. Patterns begin to emerge, vague sometimes as the first gray tones of a photo swimming up through the developing fluid, but growing more clear. And it is that pattern, I guess, that really caught me. And I think I want to follow that pattern toward a kind of rediscovery of the American West. Some of these sources, I hope, will be new to you, so that it's not all hash. Some of them will be very familiar. Some of them represent some fairly strong and perhaps even painful stuff to hear. I suppose I should make a disclaimer like they do on public television and say, you know, this is not the feeling of the sponsor or the view of the speaker. In 1990, I had the privilege of traveling for a year in 8 western states. I got to visit with a lot of people in a lot of small towns all over the West. And I found them concerned about the things you know you're concerned about, education, the economy. But I also found them concerned about some deeper issues, the kind of pulling away of people from participation in public life, a sort of withdrawal from public participation. As one woman in Oregon said, in Eastern Oregon, it's not just that folks don't go to the Rotary or the Lions Club anymore or to church. They don't go anywhere. They stay home and they watch the TV. And then I thought about the ranchers I knew in the West who were beleaguered by environmentalists, and I thought about environmentalists who really care about the land and are worried about that. And the phrase that kept coming to my mind by the end of that year was, the pain of the West. It seemed like everywhere I went, the stress was enormous. And so that phrase sort of reverberated in my head for a long time. The pain of the West. So I want to read from some of these old documents, quite a variety of them. And then I want to make a few comments about that, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. In 499, an unknown scribe in China wrote about the kingdom of Fusang. Fusang is the Chinese word for maguey, the plant that is common in Mexico and Guatemala. The kingdom of Fusang is named for that plant. which sprouts forth like the bamboo, and the people eat the shoots. Its fruit resembles the pear, but is red. The bark is spun into cloth for dresses and is woven into brocade. The people use characters and writing, making paper from the bark of the fusang. The king of this country is termed Yuki. When the king goes abroad, he is preceded and followed by drummers and trumpeters. Iron is not found in the ground, though copper is. They do not prize gold or silver, and trade is conducted without rent, duty, or fixed prices. In olden times, they knew nothing of the Buddhist religion, but in 458, 5 beggar priests went there. They traveled over the kingdom, everywhere making known the laws, canons, and images of that faith. Priests of regular ordination were set apart among the natives, and the customs of the country became reformed. In 499, a shaman priest named Hui Xin arrived at King Chao on the Yangtze from the kingdom of Fusang, and he related the above to me, which I have duly recorded in the Imperial Archive. There is no record of those men taking slaves or of torturing Indians for information about gold or to change their minds about God. After leaving Cuba, Columbus set sail to the east a little bit to Haiti, and he found people there who knew no sect nor idolatry. They are men of very subtle wit who navigate all those seas and who give a marvelous good account of everything. As soon as I arrived in the Indies, in the first island that I found, I took some of them by force, to the intent that they should learn our speech and give me information of what there was in those parts. By 1539, Coronado had learned the uses of force. His army moved into northern New Mexico among Pueblo people, and finally, after a number of tragedies from the Pueblo people's point of view, they rebelled. According to Pedro Castañeda, Coronado ordered his soldiers, quote, not to take them alive, but to make an example of them so that the other natives would fear the Spanish. After some fighting, several hundred Indians surrendered after being promised pardon. However, Garcia Lopez de Cardenas ordered 200 stakes to be prepared at once to burn them alive. Nobody told him about the peace that had been granted them. Then when the enemies saw that the Spaniards were binding them and beginning to roast them, about 100 men who were in the tent began to struggle and defend themselves with what there was there and with the stakes they could seize. Our men who were on foot attacked the tent on all sides, and then the horsemen chased those who escaped. As the country was level, not a man of them remained alive. In 1583, Sir George Peckham, an Englishman, entrepreneur, freebooter, wrote that the savages are to be brought from falsehood to truth, from darkness to light, from the highway of death to the path of life, from superstitious idolatry to sincere Christianity, from the devil to Christ, from hell to heaven. And as if that weren't enough, he said, beside the knowledge how to till and dress their ground, they shall be reduced from unseemly customs to honest matters, from disordered riot and companies to a well-governed commonwealth, and shall be taught mechanical occupations, arts, and liberal sciences. 1716, Father Luis Velarde wrote, and truly it has been due to the particular providence of our Lord that this nation has been diminished due to continuous epidemics. For because of their pride, there are not lacking among the Pimans people who are restless and troublesome. 1769, another Franciscan. These people are without religion or government, having nothing more than diverse superstitions and a type of democracy similar to that of ants. In 1776, Tom Jefferson, commonly believed to be a friend to Indians, although I've never understood why, wrote in a letter, "I am sorry that the Indians have commenced war, but greatly pleased that you have been decisive on that head. Nothing will reduce those wretches so soon as pushing the war into the heart of their own country. But I would not stop there. I would never cease pursuing them while one of them remained on this side of the Mississippi. The Indians are a useless, expensive, ungovernable ally." There were other voices. Ben Franklin, 1784. "Savages we call them because their manners differ from ours, which we think the perfection of civility. They think the same of theirs. Our laborious manner of life compared with theirs, they esteem slavish and base. And the learning on which we value ourselves, they regard as frivolous and useless." Before Lewis and Clark, there was considerable activity in the West, even on the Missouri and the Yellowstone. In 1732-33, 100 years before the prime years of the fur trade, a rumor reached a Frenchman named Bienville that 11 French voyageurs had been killed on the Missouri by the Osage. The rumor was almost unfounded. On April 22, 1734, Bienville wrote to his superiors, "The news that I have had the honor of sending to your excellency concerning the letters I have received about the murder of 11 voyageurs, of which the Osages have been accused, has only been partly confirmed. It is true that they killed a slave and a tramp engagé with the hunters, whom they mistook for a savage. The others, who were away when the blow was struck, were frightened when they returned to where the murder had been committed, and not daring to trust any nation, they decided to go to the Illinois by land, where they arrived after 2 months' trek. Thus the officer who commanded at Arkansas, not seeing them returned, judged that they had been killed, and wrote that to me." How well known the lower Missouri was 25, 30 years before Lewis and Clark is revealed in a letter of Governor General Miraut to Antonio Rangel, Comandante of the Provincias Internas. December 12, 1785. "The Poncas have a village on the small river, below the river that runs. Nevertheless, they are nomadic, naturally ferocious and cruel, kill without mercy those whom they meet on the road, although if they find themselves inferior in strength, they make friends of them. And in a word, although they are not more than 80 warriors, they only keep friendship with those whom necessity obliges them to treat as friends. The 7 villages of the Arikaras, or Rees, are located along the Missouri nearly 400 leagues from its mouth. They have about 900 warriors, and although they occupy an extensive region, its dryness and barrenness does not supply animals with their regular pasturage, and they therefore lack them. The Paros were in former times the most numerous nation on the continent, but the wars with which other nations have made against them have destroyed them to such an extent that at present they form only 4 small groups. They number about 350 men, very skillful with the arrow and in running. The wandering Apaches, like the Paros, are better known in your provinces than in this one. They inhabit the borders of New Mexico and are considered the best warriors on the banks of the Missouri. They dominate all the neighboring tribes, and though divided into several war parties or parcerias, they all live in perfect friendship. The Sioux, who extended from the River of the Friars to the source of the Mississippi, are like the Apache, the dominating nation on the left bank of the Missouri. They are wanderers and live in several groups. Viejo de Garoqui wrote to Muñino y Redondo on June 25 of 1789, 113 years, you'll note, to the day before Custer would die. One of the many enthusiastic Englishmen who roamed these western countries of the King's dominions inhabited only by Indians has arrived here. This person, although a young man, says he has traveled for nearly 5 years from the English establishment of Hudson Bay toward the west, among various Indian nations, crossed the Mississippi and the Missouri, and arrived at a cordillera of mountains which divide the waters, some to this ocean, others to the Pacific. He reports that the furthest nation he reached assured him that about 100 miles from that place there was a river which empties into the Pacific Ocean, and he adds that the distance to it was short. He has made a map, which I have seen, and I have furnished means in order to obtain a copy. American interest in the region was perhaps best expressed in an exchange of letters in 1790, 14 years before Lewis and Clark. The War Office, 20th December, 1789, to General Harmar at Fort Washington in Illinois. Dear Sir, the subject I am about stating must be retained by you as a profound secret, and I depend on your honor not to communicate thereon now or hereafter, excepting with the governor of the Western Territory, St. Clair, whom I shall refer to you. It is important that the official information of all the Western region should be as precise and as extensive as the nature of things will permit. You will thereafter exercise your mind in obtaining such information. Devise some practicable plan for exploring the branch of the Mississippi called the Missouri, up to its source and all its southern branches, and tracing particularly the distance between the said branches and any of the navigable streams that run into the great North River, which empties itself into the Gulf of Mexico. In order that you may better comprehend my idea, I send you a map of the said river and its conjectural relation to the Missouri. You will see that this object cannot be undertaken with the sanction of public authority. An enterprising officer with a non-commissioned officer, well acquainted with living in the woods and perfectly capable of describing rivers and countries, accompanied by 4 or 5 hardy Indians perfectly attached to the United States, would, in my opinion, be the best mode of obtaining the information requested. Could you engage 2 such parties and send them off at different periods of 1 or 2 months apart? It is highly probable that one, if not both, would succeed and return. Endeavor by all means to find suitable characters for this hardy enterprise, and having found them, dispatch them as soon as possible. I say nothing about their equipments or the manner of their being furnished, leaving that to you and the governor's judgment, and those to whom you may confide the direction of the enterprise. Pocket compasses would be necessary to their success, and pencils and paper to assist their remarks. Were it practicable to make the operation with canoes, it would be most satisfactory. I am, dear sir, with great esteem, your most humble servant, Henry Knox. I'm not so sure about the esteem if he thought he had to tell him to take compasses and pencils and paper. Well, General Harmar picked a man named John Armstrong, who had been a captain in the Revolutionary War, a very successful and courageous soldier, outstanding woodsman, frontiersman, still with the Army in the Illinois Territory. He explained his task to him and sent him off, and then on March 5th, he received another letter from Henry Knox. So he wrote to John Armstrong as follows, March 8th, 1790, Sir, since the communication I made to you, another letter has been received from the War Office, which mentions, quote, that the party employed on that business should be habited like Indians in all respects, and on no pretense whatever discover any connection with the troops. Of course, they will not take any written orders with them. Acknowledge the receipt of this letter and govern yourself accordingly. You may then burn it. Persevere in the undertaking, if the governor should judge it advisable, as you find by this last letter that it is expected the business must commence and be pursued. Well, the governor of the Western Territory thought the idea unsound. His reasons are enlightening and to be expected and easy to understand, "It is, sir, I believe, at present, altogether impracticable," he wrote. "It is a point on which some people are feelingly alive all over, and all their jealousy awake. Indians to be confided in, there are none. And if there were, those who would be most proper and others are now at war." John Armstrong agreed. In his report, he said, "As to Indians well attached to the United States, I know not where they are to be found." Despite this, John Armstrong went alone beyond St. Louis, up the Missouri, till at some point, we do not know, he met French trappers who warned him that the intertribal warfare was so severe he could not move from one tribe to the next with any kind of safe passage. They would not pass him on, and so he turned around and came back. In 1796, 7 years before Lewis and Clark, James Mackay gave orders to John Evans of Fort Charles as follows: "Instructions given to John Evans for crossing the continent in order to discover a passage from the sources of the Missouri to the Pacific Ocean. During the time of your absence from this place and during your journey to reach the Pacific or any other place, you will observe the following instructions." And then they're listed by article. Article 1 contains the instructions of the kinds of journals to keep. They follow quite closely. Actually, they don't follow, they precede quite closely the instructions given to Lewis and Clark for recording their observations. But Article 7 struck me as kind of interesting. "You will take heed not to fall in with some parties of savages where there are neither women nor children, as they are almost always on the warpath. It would not be prudent to appear at any nation if you can avoid it, unless it be in their villages. And in spite of this, be well on your guard. You will never fire any guns, except in case of necessity. You will never cut wood, except with a knife, unless it should be strictly necessary. You will never build a fire without a true need, and you will avoid having the smoke seen from afar. You will not camp too early, and will always leave before daylight. You will always be on guard against ambushes and will always have your arms in good condition, changing the tinder evening and morning. And you will never separate them from you or place them in the hands of the savages. When you will see some nations, raise your flag a long way off as a sign of peace, and never approach without speaking to them from a distance. When you will enter a village, stop and ground your arms at a small distance until they come to receive and conduct you. Appear always on guard, and never be fearful or timid, for the savages are not generally bold, but will act in a manner to make you afraid of them. If, however, they see that you are courageous and venturesome, they will soon yield to your wishes. You will recollect that the pipe is a symbol of peace, and that when they have smoked with you, there is no longer any danger. Nevertheless, you must beware of treason. On all occasions, be reserved with your detachment as well as with the savages. Always give to your conduct the air of importance, and show goodwill toward everyone, white or red." I couldn't help but think that sounds perhaps a little like a black mother in Chicago sending her child off to an integrated school on the first day. Be cool. Our concern with the Missouri and the Yellowstone lends some interest to the report of Jean-Baptiste Trudeau, a voyageur, made in 1796. His report is described as containing an exact account of the most remarkable rivers that empty there from above the great river Platte to above the Mandan and Gros Ventre nations, of their name and their distance, with a general idea of the savage people recently visited by the subjects of His Catholic Majesty, of their customs, religions, maxims, usages, commerce, and other remarks, as well as of those who dwell upon the banks of this great river, as of those who wander over the neighboring countries to the westward. The Missouri, he wrote, above the river of the Cheyenne, turns to the northeast a distance of 4 or 5 leagues, and afterwards it turns again to the west as far as the Mandan. On the north side, from there up to the Gros Ventre, it receives only a single river, which issues forth about 60 leagues above the mouth of this river of the Cheyenne. On the west side of the Missouri, there are 5 rivers, all of inconsiderable size. It is estimated that the Mandan village is distant 100 leagues from the entrance of the river of the Cheyenne. At 50 leagues above the Gros Ventre, to the west of the Missouri, there discharges a large river called the River of the Yellowstone, which is almost as broad and deep as the Missouri. This great river has its source in the mountains of rocks in the western part. Its banks are well supplied with wood. There are found firs, pines, North American firs, birches, cedars, and every other tree. The buffalo and other wild animals rove in herds along its banks. Many little rivers that flow into it abound in beaver beyond all belief. The nation of the Crow, a numerous people, dwells along its banks, and higher up, in ascending toward its source, are situated several other savage nations that are still unknown to us. The savages assured me that it was very deep, a long distance from its mouth. The Sioux tribes are those who hunt most for the beaver and other good peltries of the upper Missouri. They scour all the rivers and streams without fearing anyone. All the savage people which I have mentioned in this description, and of course I've just taken tiny excerpts from an extensive description. All the savage peoples which I have mentioned in this description, that is to say those which dwell west of the Missouri, are the mildest and most humane toward us of all the people of the universe. They have a great respect and a great veneration for all white men in general. They do not know how to distinguish among civilized nations, English, French, Spanish, etc., whom they call indifferently white men or spirits. On June 8, 1796, Mr. Evans, who had evidently followed his orders successfully, wrote, "As to the manners and customs of the Indians, I found they differ but little from one to the other. In the different parts of the country across which I voyaged, all that I could remark was that the nations who had but an imperfect knowledge of the whites were of a softer and better character, whilst those who have frequent communications with the whites appeared to have contracted their vices without having taken any of their virtues." A year before Lewis and Clark, Francois Leroc followed the Crow along the Yellowstone, the Powder, Shot Stone, they called it, Pryor Creek. And while in a camp on a divide between the Little Bighorn and the Bighorn, scouts came into camp one morning and reported that they had heard shots and seen running buffalo, and a little group of warriors took off immediately and came back a few hours later to report that they had seen 35 some men, and the camp was transformed, according to Leroc's journal, into an uproar, and people immediately mounted up and rode off. He was caught in the spirit of the moment, and he followed along. All of the strangers escaped, he said, except 2 scouts who were well in advance. These men were surrounded after a long race, but killed and scalped in a twinkling. When I arrived at the dead bodies, they had taken but his scalp and the fingers of his right hand. They borrowed my sheath knife, with which they cut off his left hand and returned it to me, bloody, as a mark of honor. Men, women, and children were thronging to see the dead bodies and taste the blood. Everyone was desirous of stabbing the dead bodies to show what he would have done had he met them alive and insulted them in the worst language they could give. In a short time, the remains of a human body was hardly distinguishable. Every young man had a piece of flesh tied to his gun or lance, with which he rode off to the camp singing and exultingly showing it to every young woman in his way. Some women had a whole limb dangling from their saddles. The sight made me shudder at such cruelties, and I returned home in quite different frame of mind from that in which I left it. The story of Lewis and Clark you know well. One result of the trip was the death of only one member of the troop, the death of an Indian who was stabbed by a man named Fields when he tried to steal guns and horses, and perhaps the death of another whom Lewis shot. "I shot him through the belly," he said in his journal. "He fell to his knees, then rolled over onto his right elbow. He took a shot at Mr. Lewis, which came so close, Lewis said he could feel the breeze against his skull. But then the man crawled off into the rocks with a companion, and Lewis did not venture to follow. George Frederick Ruxton, in Life in the Far West, captured not only the tone and the style, but the mindset of the average mountain man. 'Twas about calf time, maybe a little later, not 100 years ago by a long chalk, that the biggest kind of rendezvous was held up to Independence, a mighty handsome little location, way up on the Missouri. A pretty smart lot of boys was camped there, about a quarter from the town, and the way whiskey flowed that time was some now, I can tell you. There was old Sam Owens, him as got rubbed out by the Spaniards at Sacramento or Chihuahua. This hoss doesn't know which, but he went under anyhow. Well, Sam had his train along, ready to hitch up for the Mexican country. 20 thundering big Pittsburgh wagons, and the way his Santa Fe boys took in the liquor beat all, eh, Bill? Well, it did. Bill Bent, his boys camped the other side of the trail. They was all mountain men. And Bill Williams and Bill Tharp, the Pawnees took his hair on Pawnee Fork last spring. 3 Bills, and them 3's all gone under. Shirley Hatcher went out that time, and wasn't Bill Gary along too? Didn't him and Chaminade sit in camp for 20 hours at a deck of euchre? Them was Bent's Indian traders up on the Arkansas. Poor Bill Bent. Them Spaniards made meat of him. He lost his top knot to Taos. A clever man was Bill, as I ever knowed, to trade a robe or throw a buffler at his tracks. Old St. Vrain could knock the hindsight off him, though. When it come to shooting, and old Silverheels spoke true, she did. Plumb center she was, eh? Well, she wasn't nothing else. Them greasers paid for Bent's scalp, they tell me. Old St. Vrain went out of Santa Fe with a company of mountain men, and the way they made him sing out was slick as shooting. He counted a coup, did St. Vrain. He throwed a Pueblo his hat on poor Bent's shirt. I guess he tickled that nigger's hump ribs. Fort William ain't the lodge it was and never will be again now he's gone under. But St. Vrain's pretty much of a gentleman, too. If he ain't, I'll be doggone, eh, Bill? He is so. And Chavez, he had his wagons along. He was only a Spaniard anyhow. And some of his teamsters put a ball into him his next trip, made a raise of his dollars. Uncle Sam hung him for it, I heard, but I can't believe it nohow. If them Spaniards wasn't born for shooting, why was beaver made? You was with us that spree, Jimmy. 1868, after the Fetterman fiasco, Sherman wired General Sheridan, "We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, children. Nothing less will reach the root of this case." Sheridan's orders to Custer on his way to the Washita: kill or hang all warriors. And Sherman himself wired Custer: kill as many as you can. In 1872, General Francis C. Walker was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He said to Congress, "There is no question of national dignity, be it remembered, involved in the treatment of savages by civilized powers. With wild men, as with wild beasts, the question of whether one shall fight, coax, or run is only a question of what is easiest and safest." 1876, Custer got his comeuppance. But a more settled West was not much more conducive to a gentle spirit. Less than 25 years after Custer died, Rudyard Kipling came to Montana. He came from the West by way of California. Went up the coast through Oregon, Washington. He was writing letters back to a newspaper in India. And he said, "There is a great deal in the remark of a discontented traveler. Quote, when you have seen a fine forest, a bluff, a river, and a lake, you've seen all the scenery of Western America. Sometimes the pine is 300 feet high, and sometimes the rock is. Sometimes the lake is 100 miles long. But it's all the same, don't you know? I'm getting sick of it," end quote. I dare not say getting sick, I'm only tired. If Providence could distribute all this beauty in little bits where people most wanted it, among you in India, it would be well. But it is en masse overwhelming, with nobody but the tobacco-chewing captain of a river steamboat to look at it. Men said if I went to Alaska, I should see islands even more wooded, snow peaks loftier, rivers more lovely than those around me. That decided me not to go to Alaska. I went east to Montana, after another horrible night in Tacoma among the men who spat. Why does a Westerner spit? It can't amuse him, and it doesn't interest his neighbor. Eastward then to Montana, I took my way for the Yellowstone National Park, called in the guidebooks Wonderland. This is 1898. But the real wonderland began in the train. We were a merry crew. One gentleman announced his intention of paying no fare and grappled the conductor, who neatly cross-buttocked him through a double plate glass window. His head was cut open in 4 or 5 places. A doctor on the train hastily stitched up the biggest gash, and he was dropped at a wayside station, spurting blood at every hair, a scarlet-headed and ghastly sight. The conductor guessed that he would die and volunteered the information that there was no profit in monkeying with the North Pacific Railway. There was a row in our car toward morning, a man having managed to get querulously drunk in the night. Up rose a Cornishman with a red head full of strategy and strapped the obstreperous one into his bunk, smiling hugely as he did so. And a delicate little woman in a far bunk watched the fray and called the drunken man a damned hog, which he certainly was, though she needn't have been quite so coarse about it. Our train climbed till we struck violent cold and an Indian reservation, and the noble savage came to look at us. He was a flathead and unlovely. Most Americans are charmingly frank about the Indians. Let us get rid of him as soon as possible, they say. We have no use for him. Some of the men I meet have a notion that we in India are exterminating the native in the same fashion, and I have been asked to fix a date for the final extinguishment of the Aryan. I answer that it will be a long business. Very many Americans have an offensive habit of referring to natives as heathen. Mohammedans and Hindus are heathen alike in their eyes, and they vary the epithet with pagan and idolater. I was listening to yarns in the smoking compartment of the Pullman all the way to Helena, and with very few exceptions, each had for its point violent, brutal, and ruffianly murder. Murder by fraud and craft of the savage, murder unavenged by law. At the end of each tale, I was assured that the old days had passed away and that these were anecdotes of 5 years standing. One man in particular distinguished himself by holding up to admiration the exploits of some cowboys of his acquaintance and their skill in the use of the revolver. Each tale of horror wound up with, "And that's the sort of man he was," as though to say, go and do likewise. Remember that the shootings, the cuttings, and the stabbings were not the outcome of any species of legitimate warfare. The heroes were not forced to fight for their lives. Far from it. The brawls were bred by liquor, in which they assisted, in saloons and gambling halls. They were wont to pull their guns on a man, and in the vast majority of cases, without provocation. The tale sickened me, but taught one thing. A man who carries a pistol may be put down as a coward, a person to be shut out from every decent mess and club and gathering of civilized folk. There is neither chivalry nor romance in the weapon, for all that American authors have seen fit to write. I would I could make you understand the full measure of contempt which certain aspects of Western life have inspired in me. You know the feeling of discomfort, pity mingled with aversion over the boy who's making an exhibition of himself? The same emotion came back to me when an old man who ought to have known better appealed from time to time for admiration of his pitiful sentiments. It was right in his mind to insult, to maim, and to kill. Right to evade the law where it was strong and to trample over it where it was weak. Right to swindle in politics, to lie in affairs of state, and commit perjury in matters of municipal administration. The car was full of little children, utterly regardless of their parents, fretful, peevish, spoilt beyond anything I have ever seen in Anglo-India. They in time would grow up into men such as sat in the smoker and had no regard for the law. Late in the night, we ran over a skunk, ran over it in the dark. Everything that has been said about the skunk is true. It is an awesome stink. Livingston is a town of 2,000 people and the junction for the little sideline that takes you to the Yellowstone National Park. It lies in a fold of the prairie, and behind it is the Yellowstone River and the gate of the mountains through which the river flows. There is one street in the town where the cowboy's pony rests contentedly in the blinding sunshine while the cowboy gets himself a shave at the only barber shop and swaps lies at the bar. I exhausted the town, including the saloons, in 10 minutes and got away on the rolling grass downs where I threw myself to rest. Directly under the hill I was on swept a drove of horses in charge of 2 mounted men. That was a picture I shall not soon forget. A light haze of dust went up from the hoof-trodden green, scarcely veiling the unfettered deviltries of 300 horses who very much wanted to stop and graze. I was within 20 feet of the leader, a gray stallion, lord of many brood mares, all deeply concerned for the welfare of their foals. A cream-colored beast, I knew him at once for the bad character of the troop, broke back, taking with him some frivolous fillies. I heard the snick of the whip somewhere in the dust, and the fillies came back at a canter, very shocked and indignant. On the heels of the last rode both the stockmen, picturesque ruffians who wanted to know what in hell I was doing there, waved their hats and swept down the slope after their charges. When the noise of the troop had died, there came a wonderful silence on the prairie. That silence, they say, which enters into the heart of the old-time hunter and trapper and marks him off from the rest of his race. The town disappeared in the darkness, and a very young moon showed herself over a bald-headed, snow-flecked peak. Then the Yellowstone, hidden by the willows, lifted up its voice and sang a little song to the mountains, and an old horse that had crept up in the dusk breathed inquiringly on the back of my neck. From Livingston, the National Park train follows the Yellowstone River through the gate of the mountains and over arid volcanic country. A stranger in the cars saw me look longingly at the ideal trout stream below the windows, and murmured softly, "Lie off at Yankee Jim's if you want good fishing." Some of you have done that. They halted the train at the head of a narrow valley, and I leaped literally into the arms of Yankee Jim, sole owner of a log hut and an indefinite amount of hay ground, and constructor of 27 miles of wagon road, over which he held toll right. There was the hut, the river 50 yards away, and the polished line of metals that disappeared round a bluff. That was all. The railway added the finishing touch to the picture already complete of loneliness. Yankee Jim was a picturesque old man with a talent for yarns that Ananias might have envied. It seemed to me, presumptuous in my ignorance, that I might hold my own with the old-timer if I judiciously painted up a few lies gathered in the course of my wanderings. Yankee Jim saw every one of my tales and went 50 better on the spot. He dealt in bears and Indians, never less than 20 of each. Had known the Yellowstone country for years and bore upon his body marks of Indian arrows, and his eyes had seen a squaw of the Crow Indians burned alive at the stake. He said she screamed considerably. In one point did he speak the truth, as regarded the merits of that particular stretch of the Yellowstone. He said it was alive with trout. It was. And finally, from that greatest and most astute observer of American ways, Alexis de Tocqueville. From whatever angle one regards the destinies of the North American natives, one sees nothing but irremediable ills. If they remain savages, they are driven along before the march of progress. If they try to become civilized, contact with more civilized people delivers them over to oppression and misery. If they go on wandering in the wilderness, they perish. If they attempt to settle, they perish just the same. The Spaniards let their dogs loose on the Indians as if they were wild beasts. They pillaged the New World like a city taken by storm, without discrimination or mercy. But one cannot destroy everything, and frenzy has a limit. The remnant of the Indian population which escaped the massacre, in the end mixed with the conquerors and adopted their religion and mores. On the other hand, the conduct of the United States Americans toward the natives was inspired by the most chaste affection for legal formalities. The Americans treated them as independent peoples. They did not allow their lands to be taken unless they had been properly acquired by contract. And if by chance an Indian nation cannot live on its territory, they take them by the hand in brotherly fashion and lead them away to die far from the land of their fathers. The Spaniards, by unparalleled atrocities which brand them with indelible shame, did not succeed in exterminating the Indian race and could not even prevent them from sharing their rights. The United States Americans have attained both these results with wonderful ease, quietly, legally, and philanthropically, without violating a single one of the great principles of morality in the eyes of the world. It is impossible to destroy men with more respect to the laws of humanity. Well, we're Westerners. And one of the hallmarks of being Westerners, of being in a place, is knowing the stories. And many of these little sketches and reports and letters form part of the story of this place. They also tell us, as stories always do, about ourselves and how deep and how pervasive is this racism that is ours, that is part of the American West. These stories make us face what we do not like to acknowledge. For we have been, all of us, part of what Ivan Illich calls the 500-year war on subsistence. A war waged not by armies, troopers in blue, or soldiers in silver armor, but by the humanities, by the demand for literacy to triumph over the oral tradition, by the insistence that the culture has to change and learn arts and sciences. It was a war on what he called vernacular culture, vernacular language, the land, the culture, the language. We've taken in recent months, really, to looking back at the Columbus event as the beginning of it all, blaming Columbus for everything that followed. And I think up until a couple of days ago, maybe I thought the same and would have agreed. Now, I think differently. We have our own responsibility here, and we cannot lay our destructive tendencies off on Columbus. We must own up to our own bigotry. Columbus was our predecessor, but not our guide. And he did not, like the devil, make us do it. We do to one another and to the land what we choose to do. And the responsibility is ours, not his. Because he behaved as he did, we have no license to behave as we do. And we dare not let ourselves off the hook by blaming him. And American Indian people in their resentment ought not let us off the hook either, or assist us in that effort. Our heritage is mixed, courageous and cowardly, bloodthirsty and gentle, scheming and honorable, generous and greedy. But this is no reason to despair. Every culture has these same elements, and we choose which we follow. There is a connection between the way we see and the way we talk. Our vocabulary influences our perceptions in subtle ways. We rarely see beyond our language. The indescribable tends always toward the invisible. This may be a little less true for visual artists such as painters or photographers, but for the rest of us, to put it at its most peculiar, we see with our tongues as well as our eyes. Given our heritage, given the vocabulary we've learned to use with regard to our neighbors, in the face of these stories, it seems to me we have to realize that political correctness won't fix the problem. It is too deep, too troubled, too painful. Arthur Schopenhauer asks, what can be expected of beings in a situation as we are? The appropriate form of address between man and man ought to be not sir, but fellow sufferer. It corresponds to the true nature of the case, makes us see men in a true light, reminds us of what are the most necessary of all things: tolerance, patience, forbearance, charity, which each of us needs, and which each of us, therefore, owes. Perhaps we can begin to rediscover the American West by reminding ourselves of this view of our human condition. We see ourselves as white, Crow, Pawnee, Hispanic, black, Vietnamese, male, female. And it's important and interesting and wonderful to see that. But underneath the outward and visible signs, we can see another reality which requires our respect. That's the reality of the walking wounded. We are all part of that throng. There are no exceptions. Those who appear to live easily, without suffering, are perhaps the most crippled of all. To be denied loss or pain is to be denied a real life. It's possible, if one is foolish perhaps, from this vantage, to speak of racism and sexism at the same time. It's possible because they both have the same root, and the root grows so deep, extends so far down into the past, that it's almost impossible to extricate ourselves from it. The root is fear of the other, fear of the unknown. There have never been a people or a culture free of this. Every culture has its epithets, the alienating and unpleasant name for the other. Historically, each of us has known oppression, and over time, each of us has fallen victim. I'm trying to use my words carefully here. Historically, each of us has known oppression, and over time, each of us has fallen victim to being the oppressor. We seek to control the other because we do not know the other. The otherness of the other may simply be incomprehensible to us, and thus we are never sure what to expect. The otherness of the feminine for many men, I think, is so full of mystery and therefore of fear. It is simply impenetrable to males. There is a tradition old as a desert of hospitality. There is a tradition equally old to kill the stranger. So we also want to know or want to control because we know from the storied past and from our own experience that the stranger can inflict pain, bring death, become the purveyor of loss and grief. We each have our power, and one of those powers that we all have, even in the midst of apparent powerlessness, is the power to inflict pain. No one is without this. We have other, more constructive, creative powers as well. But the feeling of powerlessness often seeks to redeem itself first by causing pain to the powerful. This is no different for men or women, Indians, blacks, whites, Ainu. So I'm suggesting that any rediscovery of the American West begin by revisioning people, seeing the other from this perspective, rather than as redskin, nigger, spick, au fait. All the stereotypes must go if we are to see ourselves as we really are. I am English, I'm Saxon, I'm Irish, I'm American. These things only make me human. I'm white, I'm Protestant, I'm male, I'm alternately fallible and stupid, and thus human. I have loved, and sometimes not been loved in return, as we all have. And I have watched close friends and relatives suffer exquisite pain and die, and thus I am human. I say this not for sympathy, but to remind us that the village of loss is all-inclusive. And each of us, over the age of a month, can say the same. And so we can all approach one another, it seems to me, on this common ground. If we are to find a way out of the pain of the West, we have to alter our perception of one another. And this is the place to begin. You've been extremely patient and kind. Thank you.